Many years ago, there was a group sharing a table together at a church potluck. And on this particular Sabbath, one of the families there had extended members of the family visiting from out of town. And in this case, John, that's not his real name. We'll just use that for his name and keep the story anonymous. Well, he had his parents visiting. They lived a couple of states away. And so John was there with his wife. He was there with his children, along with his parents, and some other members of the congregation. And the entire family was sharing stories and memories, some quite humorous and rather touching. But at one point in the conversation, it turned to a different subject, and John's father mentions that for their retirement years, they wanted to relocate and be, next to the family, be near the family. And all of a sudden, things got really quiet at that table. They got really quiet. You could almost feel the tension. And then out of the silence, John says to his parents that, hey, you're welcome to live. You're welcome to live in the area, have time here, cultivate a closer relationship with the grandchildren. That would be just fine. But then John turned to his dad, to his father, and said, but Dad, you know it's too late for you and me. You know that. You know it's too late for our relationship. It's too late. I don't know about the details of why he said that, nor do I think it's important that I do, only that there were hurts behind it. There were disappointments behind it that were part of the fabric of their history, part of the fabric of that. And the result of those hurts culminated in John deciding to kind of lock his father out of his life, so to speak. Kind of put him away a little bit, create some distance, at least at some level, and for John to withdraw from that relationship as the pain was still very much alive. I have a question for everyone here. Is it too late for forgiveness? Is it too late? Is there some kind of limit that should be placed on it? And I have no doubts that, past hurts are just that, for anyone. They can run very deep. But should it ever be too late? Should it ever be too late? Or put another way, just how far should we go? How far should we go to extend forgiveness to others? Well, today, with God's help and direction, we're going to try to endeavor to answer that question. How far should we go? How far should we go to extend forgiveness to others? And we'll do that first by revisiting a rather familiar parable, that of the unforgiving servant. A parable that, as we know, it does focus on debts. The debts that we incur are the debts of sin. Talks a lot about that and the forgiveness of those debts. But within that parable, another analogy is used, and it's that of a prison, a spiritual prison that exists in the absence of forgiveness, a prison that exists in that way. And as we will see, we each have a spiritual prison key. We each have one, and we're given the choice whether we use that key or not. We're given that choice. Let's go ahead and begin by turning to Matthew chapter 18. Again, we'll review the parable of the unforgiving servant here, also referred to as the parable of the unmerciful servant in some cases. And we're going to pick it up here where Peter asks one of life's big questions. Just how many times? Just how many times do I have to forgive? How many times? Well, let's go ahead and pick it up in verse 21 of Matthew chapter 18. Then Peter came to him and said, Lord, how often shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Up to 7 times? And Jesus said to him, I do not say to you up to 7 times, but up to 70 times 7. And we notice here that Peter, in asking Jesus these questions, is bringing up several things. We know we have reviewed before the traditional rabbinical teaching of the time that forgiving more than 3 times was unnecessary. And that 3 times rule, if you will, was based in part in what we read in Amos chapter 1, where God forgave Israel's enemies 3 times, but then punished them on the 4th, punished them thereafter. And so Peter suggesting 7 times would seem generous in some ways. But it's interesting, if we were to read the parallel account, though, in Luke chapter 17 and verses 3 through 5, Jesus mentions that not only should we not put a limit, not place a limit on forgiveness, he says that even if someone sins against us up to 7 times a day, we should forgive them 7 times. And of course, he's not putting a limit on 7. It's not what he's saying. He says, however many times is however many times. We don't place a limit on that. It's interesting the apostles' response there. They said, increase our faith. Increase our faith. Choir just sang about faith, didn't they? The need for it, the vision of it, the hope that comes with faith. And the lyrics includes the words about breaking chains, delivering captives. You know, these are things we'll get to a little bit more later in the sermon. But when the apostle says increase our faith, I have little doubt that not only did they need extra help to forgive, they wanted help to have the will to do it, to have the desire to be able to forgive like that. Give me a heart to do it. I need more faith for that. You know, forgiveness can be a hard thing to do, particularly when it's about hard things. To let go of hurt, to let go of disappointments, especially the deep ones. Especially the deep ones. But Jesus was teaching a dimension on forgiveness that was far beyond what the apostles thought they needed to do. It's much deeper than that. You know, I'd mentioned too that the apostles saying increase our faith also meant that they struggled with this a bit. They probably struggled. I mean, isn't there some point where you draw the line on this? Where you draw the line with people? Aren't there some hurts that run so deep and are so unconscionable that we can deny forgiveness? Isn't there some point when we can say, it's too late. It's too late. You've gone too far. I've given you too many chances already. But the teaching here, as we read, it's quite different. Jesus indicates that repeated forgiveness is not just a guideline. He says this is a foundational principle that extends to the kingdom of God. Extends to the kingdom. And he uses this parable about the kingdom of God to teach it. He uses it that way. It's a kingdom where mercy reigns. It's that kind of kingdom. And in fact, the unforgiving will not be citizens of this kingdom. They will not. Let's move on to verse 23. He says, therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a certain king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. First character introduced in the parable is the king. The king. He must be quite the king because he controls a vast empire. Because as we'll see in a moment, one of his servants owes him an incredible sum, a huge sum. You know, the king here has far-reaching power. Far-reaching power. And the king makes a decision in the parable. Makes a decision to settle accounts, which of course the king has the authority to do. The king has that authority. And so he settles accounts with his servants, among whom would probably include provincial governors and other officials in his government that serve in various capacities. And the word settle accounts here is actually used in a commercial sense. The words, the idea here, I guess, maybe I can put it that way, frame it this way. They convey the idea that there's going to be an audit. There's going to be audit of the transactions of the business partner. Of course, everyone loves an audit, right? But one of them, when the audit was done, one of them would either receive what's due to them or they would have to pay what is due to the other as a result of the audit, depending upon the results of that. And in the parable, the king is going to settle those accounts. He's going to settle them. Let's go to verse 24. And when he had begun to settle accounts, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. Now, the results of this accounting were that at least one of the king's government administrators, one of the king's servants, owed big. He owed big. And depending on whether the talents were silver or gold or some kind of combination, the debt is likely to be in the billions of dollars in today's currency. Makes you wonder how someone could literally owe the king that much money. I mean, how could that even be? How could that be? Well, there's an interesting bit of history memorialized by the historian Josephus, and he tells of an occasion when Ptolemy Epiphanes, very good at pronouncing these names, Ptolemy Epiphanes, king of Egypt, which I believed reigned around 203 to perhaps 181 or 180 or something BC, where the king asked principal men in his empire to bid for the position of tax farmer or tax collector for various provinces under his rulership. Cilicia, Phoenicia, Judea, Samaria. And they bid 8,000 talents and were accused by Ptolemy of conspiring to bid too low. Of course, in the end, whoever bid successfully for such a contract, which is what it was, would be instantly liable to the king for the debt of 8,000 talents. Instantly liable. Makes you think of Matthew 12:48, to whom much is given, much is required. But again, the debtor here was perhaps a governor, provincial governor, tax collector, or something, who had agreed to remit to the king a specific amount of tax for a tax district. But whether that's the case or not, whether he was this or not, he came into the debt, he owed the debt, and the debt was staggering. It was staggering. Let's move on to verse 25. But as he was not able to pay, his master commanded that he be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and that payment be made. He couldn't pay, not even a small portion. He couldn't pay it. Perhaps he had collected taxes. Maybe he didn't administrate it very well. Maybe he invested some of those tax proceeds into some scheme that failed miserably. I don't know. We don't know, and it's not said here. But what is clear is that he was unfaithful in the administration of his debt. He fell short in some way. And a debt is a debt. And in ancient times, when someone failed to make good on the debt, there were three main remedies that would occur. Either the sale of the person's assets, all your stuff goes, pay the debt, or you're sold into slavery, second option. Whether you volunteer to do that, or if you're compelled to do that. Slavery was another option. And the third was debtor's prison. Debtor's prison. Debtor's prison was a means to induce the debtor's relatives and friends, family, to pay the debt so as to bring about that debtor's release. And in light of the immense size of the debt, there is no way his family, his extended family, or otherwise friends, anyone besides the king, could be induced to even pay a portion of this to get the debtor out of prison. And clearly the sale of the assets could not cover the debt such as this, so his property and lands would be seized to then be sold for what the king could get, and then the servant and his family would go into slavery, a common fate for those who couldn't pay. Let's read on, verse 26 and 27. The servant therefore fell down before him, saying, Master, have patience with me, and I will pay you all. Then the master of that servant was moved with compassion, released him, and forgave him the debt. That servant's case is hopeless. It's hopeless. And he does the only thing he can do, and he begs. It's the only thing he can do. It's interesting that the king doesn't even seem to entertain the notion of giving that servant more time, which is what he asked for. Be patient with me, and I will repay you all. Didn't seem to entertain that at all. And as is implied here, time would not have helped this servant. He was in too deep. He's in too deep. He'd gone past that, way past that. Yet knowing full well the immeasurable difference between what that servant could do, knowing full well the difference between that as compared to that debt, as compared to that, the king took pity on him, canceled the debt, let him go. He wiped out the entire obligation, all of it. And the servant was released, free and clear. You would think that if you were there observing this, that this man probably just could not even believe what just happened. One minute he and his family were to be slaves and lose everything. The next he was restored with his estate intact. But when that servant left the presence of the king, what happens next is unconscionable. So go on to verse 28, 29, and 30. He says, "But the servant went out and found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii, and he laid hands on him, took him by the throat. 'Pay me what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down at his feet, begged him, saying, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you all.' And he would not, but went and threw him into prison till he should pay the debt." The servant here, again, probably an administrator or governor or something like that. He's a fellow servant. Sees another servant, one who owed him 100 denarii, worth about 100 days of work or so, maybe $15,000 in today's currency, if I can just pick a number. And it's a meaningful amount of money, but nothing compared to the debt that had just been forgiven. And as we just read, what does he do? He grabs the other servant and he begins to choke him. He acts violently. He demands payment. And when the fellow servant asks for patience and promises to pay it in full, the same thing that he asked of the king, which in this case may have been quite possible for him to do. This violent man refuses and has his fellow servant thrown into the debtor's prison until the debt is paid in full. You know, it would appear that this fellow servant had defaulted on his debt as well, and demanding payment may have been legal, well, at least in part, except for the violence and choking, of course. But there probably was a legal agreement in place. There probably was. But in light of the mercy that he had just received, it was grossly inappropriate on all levels. Grossly. Moving on to verse 31 and 32, or 31 through 34. "So when his fellow servants saw what had been done, they were very grieved, and came and told their master all that had been done. Then his master, after he had called him, said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you begged me. Should you not also have had compassion on your fellow servant, just as I had pity on you?' And his master was angry and delivered him to the torturers until he should pay all that was due to him." Others see this. Others see this. They are grieved by what happened. And they report it to the king in detail. So as we just read, the king calls the servant back. The king's livid, and understandably so. He had forgiven the man an astronomical sum, an act of mercy so great that he didn't forgive just part of the debt, he forgave the entire portion of the debt. So why? Why wouldn't that servant have the common decency to do the same for a relatively small portion? To refuse to do so was an absolute insult to the mercy of that king. An insult. And of course we know the result. You know, did the servant go to prison as well? Yes. And not to an ordinary prison. He goes to a prison that is reserved for the king's enemies. Torture. And history has shown us, for example, that scourging and other methods were commonly used by the Romans to interrogate and to punish prisoners. Jesus intended this parable to stick in the minds and the hearts of his disciples. Before we read verse 35, let's just summarize a bit here. There is a king with the power to forgive debts. The parable represents our king, Jesus Christ. That king forgave the debt of a servant who owed him much, not partially, but fully. And that servant is likened to us. And the debt forgiven when we beg for mercy, when we repent, when we ask God for forgiveness. Like we read in 1 John 1:19, or 1 John 1:9. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. But the parable is clear about something else too here. That servant is a representative of the king. He's a representative of the king, and a representative of the king should reflect the will of the king, the direction of the king, and the government the king stands for. That servant should support the directives of that king. We're to mirror our example of our king, Jesus Christ. In the parable, this particular servant makes a very poor choice. And not only does the servant violate the literal and spiritual intent of what that king did to the servant, not only did the servant violate being an ambassador for mercy, for the mercy that was granted to him, he does violence against it. He does violence. He grabs another debtor by the throat. And the implication here is that the unforgiving, those that are practicing spiritual violence against one another. Spiritual violence. And not only that, they are practicing spiritual violence against the king. Against the king. Notice, too, that the unforgiving act of the servant was very visible. It's very visible. We know that, when any of us sin, or make a mistake, have an error, it isn't always immediate or seen immediately. But in the spiritual realm, God sees all, and he knows all. And experience shows us that for the most part, sin will at one point or another manifest itself somehow. Somehow, in some way, perhaps in what is said, perhaps in what is done, perhaps in the way we might act around someone to whom we have not forgiven, how we might act. But regardless of how that is revealed, so bad is this in the eyes of the king that the servant has become an enemy of the king. And an enemy of the king is consigned to the worst of prisons. The worst. And again, of course, this is a spiritual parallel that's going on here. But notice, too, what the sentence became. Servant was delivered to the torturers until he paid all, which, as we know, is impossible. It's impossible. Only the king has the power to reverse that sentence. Only the king. And unless that happened, the fate of the unforgiving servant, if not reversed, brings it to its natural conclusion, to its end, to their end. In light of that, let's read verse 35 of Matthew chapter 18, where Christ says, "So my heavenly Father will also do to you, if you do not from his heart, to each of you, if you do not from his heart, does not forgive his brother his trespasses." From his heart. Very sobering. Torture, prison. Think about the implications of being unmerciful, of being unforgiving. God says, I need you to have this in mind. Speaking for myself, when it comes to torture, I don't even want to think about it or imagine it. But God does ask us to understand and contemplate it as part of the parable's lesson, as part of it. If you're to think about the word prison, if you're to think about that word, what would come to your mind? What would come? Perhaps you could or would visualize some kind of confinement, in some kind of a cage. Maybe you'd think of a prison cell. That might come to your mind. Maybe a razor wire fence for which you cannot escape from. Maybe bars of steel, bars of iron. Maybe in a crowded room with no privacy. It's hard to see in this picture here, but those bunks are stacked 3 high. Prisons are crowded in some places. Or perhaps you might think of solitary confinement. Or for that matter, a prison yard that you can't see out of. Or maybe something else. In the United States, we have over 5,000 prisons and jails. Roughly 1,800 state and federal correctional facilities and 3,200 local and county jails. We live in a nation where the incarceration rate is the highest in the world. 2013, the most recent and comprehensive statistics I could find, there were over 2.2 million adults in prisons and jails. That's 1 out of every 110 of the population. But when you add another 4.7 million adults under correctional supervision, those under probation or on parole, we're talking about 6.9 million in total. That's 1 in every 35 adults. To add some context to this, we have more jails and prisons than we do degree-granting colleges and universities. And in many parts of America, there are more people living in prisons than on college campuses. Perhaps many of us know of someone spending time behind bars. There's someone I have known for many years that is still serving time. Recently, it's been at the Monroe Correctional Complex. Before that, it was spent at the Washington State Penitentiary, basically a prison the size of a small city. He will be 27 years old on his expected release date in December of this year. He's currently serving the last year of a 5-year sentence, mostly for illegal drug use and theft. But most of his adult life has been spent behind bars. Made some very serious mistakes in his life, including being a repeat offender. In his letters, we see glimpses of that gentle kid we used to know. The kid with a curiosity. You can read it in his letters. While at the same time, in those letters, we see elements of a young man that's been hardened by the realities of prison time. He owes a debt. He owes a debt to society, and he's paying that debt in a manner of speaking. And of course, it's our sincere hope that he will lead a very different life when he gets out than the one that got him there. It's our sincere hope. You think about prisons, they exist all over the world. This happens to be a picture of Alcatraz, but for the most part, people go to prison for breaking various laws, oftentimes breaking them over and over again. Some U.S. statistics suggest that 3 out of every 4 will be repeat offenders and will go back to prison. So when we talk about prisons in the spiritual sense, I'm not saying that there are not consequences, for the errors and bad decisions that people make, ourselves included. What I am saying is that while God does allow punishment consequence, He's also very clear on the need for forgiveness, on our individual sins and those of others, and that includes one to another, and it includes repeat offenders. It includes that, even if we make a mistake over and over again. And as we just visualize this concept of prisons, when we look at prison at the time this parable was taught, though, when we visualize that, that's a very different prison than we might think of today. In a modern U.S. prison, your freedoms are definitely limited. You may have no privacy, or you may be in isolation. But you know what? You'd likely have a bed. You'd be fed. Facilities would typically have adequate heat. And if you needed medical attention, you could get it. You can get it in a prison these days. That's not to suggest that there would never be a threat against your safety. As we know, many prisons have, gangs and violence, this sort of thing. But still, prison life today is very different than it would be, for example, under Roman rule. It would be very different. And if we're just sort of to work our way back in history, prisons have changed over time. Again, prisons these days would typically have a bed, bathroom facility of some kind, access to that, place to wash up. And again, this is indoors. This is indoors in a temperature-controlled environment or facility. In the past, prison might be in something entirely different. And sometimes prisons were done or administrated in rather, shall we say, creative ways. For example, the beached convict ship HMS Discovery. It was located at Deptford, southeast London. It served as a convict hall between 1818 and 1834. I would doubt that that thing is as comfortable as the existing prisons we have now. During medieval times or the Middle Ages, prisons were often deep in the dungeon of some castle. There, prison might mean that you're shackled. You're shackled to a wall or a post. Today these pictures of these historical places here, or these historical places now have lighting in them. But in the day they would have been very dark, unless somebody came in with a torch. And in places like this, and we go through history, there's deprivation, there's torture as well, and that was not uncommon. Even think back to the times of the Spanish Inquisition. Prisons were different. Might even be something carved out of a rock. Might be something like this picture shows. But in the times of the Roman Empire, some of their prisons had a similar theme. The Mamertine prison, also known in antiquity as the Tullianum, was a prison in ancient Rome. Prisons such as these have changed over time. They have been built, they've been rebuilt, they've been modified, adjusted over the centuries. But this kind of prison would typify the Roman way, if you will, of doing things. It would typify that. The Mamertine prison was located in the Comitium. This was just an open-air public meeting space located in the northwest corner of the Roman Forum. And this is where much of the political and judicial activity of Rome occurred, was in this open forum. And when you think of imprisonment, as we think of it today, it was not really a sentence under Roman statutory law. It really wasn't. You could be subject to detention, and detention included debt bondage, the wearing of chains and so on. You could also be sentenced to hard labor, might have to work in the mills, in the mines, the quarries, those kinds of things. And certainly slaves, or what they deemed to be slaves of the lower class, they were sentenced to hard labor. And they were held in prison camps. However, incarceration in facilities such as the Tullianum was intended to be a temporary measure prior to either the trial or, unfortunately, an execution. Basically, the facility had two levels. And here's an artist's rendition of the cross-section of it. This upper level you see here is called the carcer, the interrogation room, the holding pen, if you can put it that way. This one down here is called the Tullianum. This is the isolation cell. There's no housekeeping in this pit. There's little air circulation. It's dark. When describing it, the Roman historian Sallust notes, there is a place called the Tullianum, about 12 feet below the surface of the ground. It is enclosed on all sides by walls, and above it is a chamber with a vaulted room of stone. He said neglect, darkness, and stench, unfortunately, make it hideous and fearsome to behold. Basically what happened here, I think it's important that we understand the process of what happens in these places, as hard as it is maybe to hear. But basically the prisoner, after interrogation, would be lowered through the hole on the bottom of the carcer, which is the ceiling of the Tullianum, to this isolation cell. The prisoner may be alone. The prisoner may be joining others. But the Tullianum was a place of fear, of neglect, was of darkness, cold, damp, worst kinds of hygiene and smells. It was a place of deprivation. And there they would wait. They would wait their trial and the result of that trial. And some were just left there. Just left there. You know, prison, as God describes for the unforgiving, again in the context of the parable, is intended to bring something to our minds and our hearts. You know, whether it be the debtor's prison that someone is willing to sentence someone to, or the debtor's prison that the unforgiving servant is sent to when they're not merciful. Of course, the latter's the worst, because it includes the concept of torture, of anguish, and the concept that the debtor will have to pay the entire debt. And as we know in the example in the parable, that is an impossibility to do. Only the king can get him out. Only the king can. So what's described here is a spiritual prison. Spiritual prison of our mind and our heart. It's a place of spiritual anguish. Spiritual torment. You know, what's so interesting about this? There's a parallel here of what the ultimate fate will be for our adversary. You know, going into the pit. Yet what remains so fascinating is that each of us hold a prison key. Each of us hold one, and we decide. We decide will we use it or not. We make that decision. I have with me a key from the Roman era, 1st or 2nd century. Imagine, if you will, that you have a similar key. Imagine it. And that key is a prison key. Prison key. Now think through this parable of the unforgiving servant and what you would do or what you should do. Because the question of the hour for each of us is that, have I locked someone up in that prison? This prison of my own making? Have I done that? Because if there is, the jailer is in the prison as well. The jailer's there too. If I lock someone up, I'm in a prison too. I'm in a prison. How far should we go to extend forgiveness to others? How far? You know, you think about forgiveness, it's on the opposite end of the spectrum from vengeance. On the opposite end. In Romans 12:19, we read, "Beloved, do not avenge yourselves, but rather give place to wrath, for it is written, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' says the Lord." And this verse is quoting Deuteronomy 32:35, which reads, "Vengeance is mine, and recompense. Their foot shall slip in due time. For the day of their calamity is at hand, and the things to come hasten upon them." You know, human nature loves to keep score. Loves to keep score. Human nature keeps a ledger. Keeps a ledger. And human nature, of course, also loves to judge. Human nature also likes to even the score or stay ahead of it. But these verses tell us to release. Release the anger. Release the responsibility for judging this person in this way. And leave it to God. It's not saying we can't identify sin. We can and should do that. It's not saying that there are not repercussions. There are not consequences from sin. It's not saying that we shouldn't confront the sin. What is being said is we're to defer. We're to defer judgment to God. We're to defer this kind of judgment, vengeance, to God. It's interesting, this word recompense means to reciprocate, means to pay back, as you might think of it, but also it means restitution. And what it affirms is that if there is a ledger to be had, if there is a ledger, it's God who should keep it. It's God who should keep that ledger. Human nature loves a ledger. So how do we know when we're forgiving? We know when we erase the ledger. We know when we no longer keep the score. And we no longer have a desire to even look at that ledger. When we no longer have a desire to write in it. When that ledger fades. And when it fades to nothing. And we know it when we no longer pick up. And we no longer use one of these. Symbolic of a prison key. We move from a ledger that's discernible to a ledger that's not. You know, part of what's going on here when we forgive someone is this abandonment of our human desire for justice on our terms. We abandon that notion in favor of something actually rather simple. God's way of how love is to be demonstrated. It's the same thing that is so much the basis of our conversion. Our way out, or our way goes out, God's way comes in. And I'd like to reference a few verses in 1 Corinthians chapter 13 and read them from the New Living Translation. I'll go ahead and read verses 4 through 7. 1 Corinthians 13. Love is patient and kind. Love's not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. It does not demand its own way. It's not irritable. And it keeps no record of being wronged. No record. Doesn't say you can keep a fractional record. You can keep a record contingent on whether they repent in the manner in which we want them to. Love doesn't keep the record. Doesn't keep it. Verse 6 and 7. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up. Never loses faith. It is always hopeful and endures through every circumstance. You know, earlier we referenced a parallel account to the parable of the unforgiving servant, as we find in Luke chapter 17, where Jesus mentions not to put a limit on forgiveness. And in verse 5 of that chapter, again, the apostles said, increase our faith. Increase our faith. Love never loses faith. It never loses it, even if the offense is unconscionable, even with a repeat offender. Love keeps no records of wrong. Love does not bring it up again. And as hard as it is, or may be, love places that sin, the abuse, the pain, the hurt, all of which are very, very real. Very real. And love places those things in the loving hands of God who knows best how to handle it. Love has that capacity. That capacity. You know, in the parable of the unforgiving servant, we're taught the importance of forgiving someone else while keeping in mind what debt the King, Jesus Christ, has paid and will continue to pay for each of us. You know, though we won't go into detail about reconciliation one to another, as found in Matthew chapter 18, the rules are actually rather simple. Someone does something against you, go tell him. You and him alone. If you work it out, you've gained a brother or sister, as the case may be. If he won't listen, then bring our one or two witnesses with you. You know, this is not about bringing witnesses against the brother. You don't bring people, hey, I got these two people on my side, and we're going to go against the brother. It's not for the reason for that process. We bring witnesses to witness the process of reconciliation. That's what that's for. Of course, if that doesn't work, then it goes to the church. Third step. And I mean no disrespect by this, but I've been surprised over time about many people who on one hand have been hurt and deeply hurt, who do not, on the other hand, show any kind of willingness really to follow this process that God put in place. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm also surprised at how many people have hurt others who just make it so difficult for someone to kind of reconcile with them. I'm not saying that it exists in the congregation here at all. I don't mean that. And I don't mean to overgeneralize or be assumptive. But to underscore this concept, when it comes to forgiveness and reaching out and reconciling that, we make this easy or we make it hard. We go one way or the other. Let's turn to Matthew chapter 5. Matthew chapter 5, we already established the need to forgive others, but what if you or I are the offending party? What if I'm the offending party? What happens then? Well, in any event, even if someone is unaware at a point in time, if Matthew 18 is followed regarding reconciliation, then the offending party should be aware that there's something that needs to be reconciled at some point. Those are followed. Let's go ahead and read verses 23 through 26 of Matthew 5. It says, "Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you're on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there till you have paid the last penny." We see a very similar teaching applied to the offending party. And we see two illustrations that Jesus gives. First is given in a setting of temple worship, concerns a brother. Second is a judicial setting and concerns an adversary. Of course, humanly, we're more likely to remember when we have something against others than the other way around. But what's included here in this teaching, and God's saying, if you want to worship me and you want that worship acceptable, then you have to first make efforts to reconcile. It's required. Notice, too, that we're to quickly settle matters with the offended adversary while still on the way with him, before it gets escalated. As we just already reviewed, in the ancient world, debtors were jailed till the debts were paid. And so what this urges is a sense of urgency in reconciliation. Do everything in your power to reconcile. Everything. As much as depends on you, live peaceably with all. And you know what? We need to ask forgiveness of our debts to others as well. Please forgive me for what I have done. To be candid, for the times in my life when I had an unforgiving attitude, and I have had over my life an unforgiving attitude at times, an unmerciful frame of mind and heart. I remember a period in my life where I was mad at somebody for almost a year. A year. I'm sure I've done more than my fair share of this. But, when I look at it honestly and after the fact, I was miserable. I was angry, bitter. I didn't sleep well the whole year, for the most part. Part of the reason is that the sun did not go down on my wrath. I carried it with me. I didn't even feel well. I'm not talking just about spiritual well-being or spiritual sickness. It manifested itself physically as well. It did. But as I look back, I always had the choice of what to do with the key. I always had that choice. I always had that option. Always did. Always did. The wisdom of God is so different than the human mind. It's very different. Different frame of mind and heart, and includes overlooking a transgression. We read about this in Proverbs 19:11. Oops. There we go. The discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. So once again, what are we going to do with our key? What are we going to do with it? Because when we lock people up, we also get in the way of the joy of forgiveness. Also, that get in the way of the joy of forgiveness as well. You remember when the choir sang about faith? Breaking chains, delivering captives. Who doesn't want to help with that? And all the joy that comes with it. What does a captive do when they're set free? When they understand where their freedom came from? Think there's joy there? Absolutely. And of course, all of this makes us, or begs the question, is God's forgiveness greater than any sin? Is it greater than any abuse, any pain, any hurt? Is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ big enough? Is it big enough? Is it significant enough to do that? To cover? Yes, it is. And there is a joy that God gives with forgiveness. A joy. And when it comes to the joy of being forgiven, I hope you don't mind me sharing an experience of my own on this. I remember years ago there was an incident, particular incident when I don't mind sharing this with you because it's a useful example, but I just made a really bad judgment call. I was really vocal about it. And if that were not enough, I arrogantly defended my position. So, there was a situation. Thought the wrong thoughts, said the wrong things. Serious mistake was made, and a good friend of mine who bore the brunt of this unfortunate drama didn't say a word. Didn't say anything. Of course, later on, it hits you often when you do stuff like that. What have I done? I was so wrong. I'm so embarrassed. You ever talk to yourself, by the way, when you do something wrong? Yeah? No one's in the room. And you're saying, what's wrong with you? What are you thinking? Those kinds of things. If I could borrow a phrase from one of our teens here, it was an epic failure. That's yours. Well, as you might imagine, I owed my friend a heartfelt apology. And you know what? He deserved to hear that face to face. He deserved that. Wasn't sure how he's going to take it. Sitting in the front seat of his pickup truck. Apologizing, feeling small, as I should. And he starts to smile, which is very concerning, by the way. Disconcerting, to be candid. But then he looked at me and he said, and he had a straight face at that point, he conveyed something that I hope I'll never forget. He just looked at me and he said, Barry, I can't count, nor do I want to count the number of times that God has forgiven me. And he says, and frankly, it is such a small thing to do to pass that on to others. See, I am happy to oblige. And then he went on to say, I was hoping it would come to this. I was hoping it would. He said, let us go forward as if it never happened, when there's no need to ever speak of it again. I can't think of words I would have rather heard than what I did. Words that heal. Words that echoed what we read in Proverbs 19:11. Discretion of a man makes him slow to anger, and his glory is to overlook a transgression. There is a joy in forgiveness. Forgiveness from God, and there's a joy in forgiveness from one another. There's a joy. In the introduction, I shared the story of a father and a son. It was about a time when the son said, and I remember these words clearly too. When he looked at his dad and said, Dad, it's too late. It's too late for you and me. It's too late. It's too late for our relationship. And again, I never came to know the details behind that statement. But again, I suspect and know, or shall I know, that the hurt was real. It's part of their history. It's real. But over the years after that, I saw a father that always hoped that his son would forgive him. And I saw a son who perhaps made some inroads for that, but never really did. Never really forgave his father, and others saw it too. And you know, we saw the pain of that as well. Can't disguise that. Can't disguise pain like that. When it comes to the key to the prison, when it comes to that, what are you and I going to do? What are we going to do? Because, brethren, it is not too late to unlock the door. It's not too late. It's not too late to do that. It's not too late to forgive. It isn't. And as we close, I'd like us to, I'll actually read the first 5 verses of Psalm chapter 32 and what is referred to as the joy of forgiveness. And as we think about the joy of forgiveness that God gives and the sacrifice behind it, which we will once again memorialize here at the Passover service this year. Let us also think of our part in this, forgiveness with others and the need for forgiveness, for our forgiveness as well, those needs, and that we ask God to release us from our debts, from prison, that we willingly release others from that prison as well. We release them. That we, in every respect, be the representatives of the King of Kings, Jesus Christ, that we need to be. Let's go ahead and read Psalm 32, 1 through 5. It said, "Blessed is he whose transgression is forgiven, whose sin is covered. Blessed is the man to whom the Lord does not impute iniquity, and in whose spirit there is no deceit. When I kept silent, my bones grew old through my groaning all the day long. For day and night your hand was heavy upon me. My vitality was turned into the drought of summer. Selah. I acknowledged my sin to you, and my iniquity I have not hidden. I said, I will confess my transgressions to the Lord, and you forgave the iniquity of my sin. Selah. So, brethren, what are we going to do with the key?